Now today we're going to look at two different follow focuses, and one, the whole setup for me cost me about $200, a little bit over that, and another one I got from Neewer cost me $70. So we'll compare the two, and we'll see what some of the differences are. And maybe to start off at the beginning, when you find Fotga and Neewer, as far as I can tell, they're the same company. So I can't confirm or deny that, but as far as I can tell, they are the same company. Like Fotga is Neewer Premium or Extra. Now there's a couple of things that I think are important in a follow focuses and things that I personally want. The first thing is you don't want a lot of backlash. You don't want a lot of play in the control itself. You know, if the whole point is you put a mark, you want to hit that mark. So you don't want something where, you know, your indicator is at your mark and you're not in focus. You don't want it. That's crap. You don't want it. So obviously, that's the most important thing in any follow focus is that you don't have any backlash. You don't have any play in the gearing. Secondly, you need to have a proper indicator and an index on here where you can write marks on it. And on this Neewer here, they both have basically a little whiteboard on there where you could just write a little mark with a dry erase marker, and then when you're done, you could just wipe it right off and you're good to go for your next setup. The other thing that's important for me, because I'm using photography lenses here, especially these Sigmas, whenever you focus, if you get to the end stop, it's like a soft stop. So you get to the end and you can keep turning the focusing ring past that stop. So that's one thing you don't want. So for me, hard stops are important for me. So here I have a Sigma 50mm 1.4 and shooting on the Sigma 18-35 1.8. And in both cases, they both have that problem. So having hard stops lets me know, okay, I've hit the end. So that means when I'm setting up my focus gearing on the lens itself, I don't have to worry about pulling through it. So I get to the end, it's the end. And especially like in this case, okay, like I need to get to infinity, I'm at infinity. I want closest focus, that's it, I'm at closest focus. So it's important to have those stops for me. If you have cinema lenses, or if you have something like my Tamron lens, it actually has hard stops built into it, so you don't have to worry about pulling through there. But stops are still good. If I want to say like, I'm going to pull focus from here, and that's in focus, and then to here, then I know like, okay, so here's first position, here's second position, right? So stops are good for that too. Another thing that's nice, especially like what this Fotga has, you don't get it with the Neewer, is the gear on here. You can actually change it out. I have the smallest gear on there, but I have 3 different gear sizes. So in this case, when I have the smallest gear on there, I get almost a full turn on the knob here for my focus, from infinity to closest focus. But if I want to put the largest gear on, that'll reduce it down to half a turn. Now, that's important because say on my Sigma 18-35, when I have that set up on the smallest gear size, then I'll actually get more than 1 turn out of it. A little bit more, not much. But then I can go to the next gear size, and then I'm almost there where I basically have 1 turn on it. So that gives me 1 full turn on it. I could use the stops, and that's just good to be able to change that out. And with this Fotga, what's nice about it, it's all basically toolless. So if I want to change the gearing out on it, then I don't really have to necessarily worry about futzing around with getting Allen keys and whatnot. And if I wanted to take this off, say move it to the other side, I could do that, it's toolless. Or if I want to move to a different gearing size, I'll put the biggest one on there. You know, changing it out is not a hard job. Tighten that back up. And I'm ready to run. Another nice thing to have, it's not exactly necessary, is if you have adjustable tension. Now on this Fotga here, there's a little screw underneath it, and that makes it much easier to turn. Or if I want a little bit of drag on it, then I could adjust for that. And that's something, again, you don't get that with the cheaper Neewer, but here, a little bit harder to pull, a little bit more tension. And a lot of times that extra tension just gives you that little bit of extra control, and it's good to have. Now, every good follow focus should have a hole on the side for a 12mm accessory. In this case, a speed crank, or you could put a whip. And those are good for, of course, two different scenarios. It's called a speed crank because it gets you a lot faster movement. So say I set my AB stops up and I have a long throw on it, it allows me to crank it very quickly from my first position to my second position. When you're shooting with a wide aperture and you're making small movements, especially when you're up close and you have a razor thin depth of field, you know, having a whip on there, it's really useful because it gives you a lot more control. It keeps your hand off of your rig, so you introduce less shaking into your shot, and you can get really fine control on it. I really think that if you're starting to shoot with something with really wide apertures and you're trying to pull focus and you're going to do close-up work, you definitely want to have a whip. And especially if you're going to have a second person pulling focus for you, it's convenient for them to be able to keep their hands off of the rig and still be able to turn that focus. So definitely one of those things. If you're going to invest in a follow focus, I would definitely get a whip too and a speed crank. They're useful to have, and really the speed crank and the whip themselves, you can find them, they're very cheap. Now I'd say for this, the DP500III, overall, it's done an excellent job for me. It actually, just coming off the rig, I can pull it straight out of there really quickly. And like right here, I have my handles on. So I don't need to worry about taking the handles off. Whereas the Neewer, if I want to set that up, I got to take these handles off to get it onto my rails. And everything is off of this one screw. So sliding it in and out and then tensioning onto the rails themselves, it's all the same knob. Whereas the Fotga, I can tighten this down and that does that axis. And then I have a separate screw for tightening down onto the rails themselves. So just a lot nicer build. Now, overall, the differences between these two follow focuses, the major differences, this one, the ring can come off. So if you needed to do some more extensive cleaning on it, you can do that with this. And on the Neewer, you can't take that off. Not a big deal. But then there's the actual, your indicator there. On the Fotga, you can move it around and set it to what position works for you best. You know, a lot of times I have it at a 45 here, just because a lot of times I'll be pulling focus by myself, so I could see where my stops are. On the Neewer, it's in a fixed position. The other thing about the indicator is once it's in that position, it's nice and tight on the Fotga, but on the Neewer, it's got, that itself has a play in it. And that's kind of what I have to say with most of the things on the Neewer. You know, the accessory slot, there's some slop in it there. On the Fotga, there's a little bit, but it's not as extreme. Everything about it, the Fotga is a little bit tighter, except for your tension control, because when you loosen it up, then it really is nice and smooth. Whereas even the Neewer, when it's unloaded, it has a set amount of resistance and you just have to deal with it. Also, there is a little bit of play, but what I found is the play actually seems to be in the dial here where it's linked onto the shaft. There's two set screws in there and it seems to have play on the shaft itself. So the accessory is a little bit sloppy. The dial handle itself is a little bit sloppy. So it's one thing when you're using the Neewer, before you pull, you kind of have to know which direction you're going so you can take up that slop that's in it so you can line it up. It's usable, but you have to know it's there and you have to be ready to deal with that. Whereas I found with the Fotga, I've been using it for a while, it's just you make your marks, you set it, you're good to go. This whole setup with the whip and the crank and everything cost me a little over $200, whereas this cost me, it was $70. Definitely usable, but then in both cases, they come with these kind of rings here. And there's some pluses and some minuses to these kind of rings. One, you could set them to any size that you want. I mean, if you have a C-mount lens, you know, you can make it really small if you wanted to put it on a C-mount lens. The downside to using something like this is as the lens gets smaller, you start losing teeth for your full rotation. So I found it's better to use something like this, whereas I could take a lens, a larger lens or a smaller lens, and in either case, I can put a ring on it, and it gives me essentially the same tooth count on the outside diameter. My setup's not going to change that much, except for moving the focus in and out to position a follow focus where the actual focus ring is. Now you may run into a couple issues whenever you're using a follow focus that's usually pretty easy to solve. One thing is, whenever you're turning it, you might see that it's actually making your shot move up and down, and that's usually, when you're using a longer or heavier lens, it's actually weighted down a bit. So then when you try and use the follow focus, the gearing actually picks the lens up. So one thing to do there is to just get a mount in there, enough to just pick that up. And then once you do that, since you're pushing the lens up and supporting the lens and getting that weight off the camera itself, then that will usually take care of that issue with your frame moving up and down. So definitely, if you're using a follow focus, you definitely want to look into extra lens supports on top of that. The other thing that you might face is if you have stutter. And that's sometimes if the lens doesn't focus that smoothly, then you want to actually get some more tension on it. That's what's good about the Fotga, being able to adjust that tension. And because you have that extra tension, that actually fighting through it actually will smooth things out. So making it harder to move will make it smoother. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but something to look into. This costs $70. If it's all you can afford, it's usable. But if you could spend the money to invest in something, there are more expensive and nicer follow focuses than this. But I feel like as you get past this is a good follow focus. And it just seems like once you go up from there, you start getting diminishing returns for your investment. So, you know, at $200, $220 all in, speed crank, whips, gearing, and everything like that, this seems like a really good option. But if you just need something as a backup, you don't want to spend a lot of money, this is good to just have as a backup. But if it's all you can afford just to get a follow focus, then yeah, it's a decent option. Like I said, it has slop in it, but just before you pull focus, all you need to do is, like I said, you catch up with the slop and know you're turning it that way. So you know, like, okay, I'm going this way, and set your mark for it. So it's, you know, or if you have your, you know, if you're shooting it like an f4, you know, that little bit of play is not going to make a big difference. Now, like here, I got a 1.4. And if I'm shooting close, that little bit of slop in there, that's going to cause issues. But again, if I know I'm going in a specific direction, then all I need to do is, like I said, catch up with the slop, then move to my mark. So I was able to get usable shots out of this. And, you know, but at the same time, you start getting a whip and a crank and everything like that. This is probably $100. So, you know, buy a crank and a whip and this, it's about half the price of what this is. If you don't, think you need a speed crank or a whip, which I don't know, I'd kind of argue that, you know, if you're going to invest in a follow focus, you should invest in those accessories. Then, you know, it's $70 and that's it. And they give you this gearing ring here. So I'll say for the Fotga, would I buy that again? Yeah, I would definitely buy that again. It starts to get a little bit more pricey, but I think, you know, overall, it's a decent follow focus. The Neewer, would I buy it again? I don't know. If I was really strapped for cash, then, and I really needed a follow focus, then yeah, I might buy it. I definitely wouldn't buy anything cheaper than this. There are some interesting options out there that are different from this. There's one with like a crank handle. I might look into that, but I'm not sure. But as far as this goes, yeah, you could work with it. It's not that great, but I would also say that because I don't really have a model number, the $70 Neewer follow focus is probably the cheapest I would go on a follow focus at all. I really wish that there were more gear options. You know, for me to take this gear off to change it to the other side, I need an Allen, whereas this has a nice fat thumb screw. The Fotga is completely toolless, but this, yeah, you need the Allen key. This has that bit of play in it, which that bugs me the most. It's just that the indicator itself has some play in it and you can't adjust it. And really, you almost have to look at it dead on. So, you know, if you have someone pulling focus for you, it probably work a lot better. But in most cases, I would try and limit the Neewer to having a first position and a second position and just pulling focus from one stop to the other. Oh, that's pretty much all I have to talk about for follow focuses. If you have any questions or you feel like I left something out, definitely leave comments below and we'll see you next time. Bye.